Hello, my name is Owais Siddiqui and I am the Multicultural Narrative Supervisor here at Fort Edmonton Park. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 6 land, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Cree, Blackfoot, Blood, Kainai, Dene, Saulteaux, and Métis nations of Alberta, as well as other First Nations who have been using these lands and the surrounding areas as a meeting ground and a sacred place since time immemorial. To them, to their heritage, and to their culture, I lend my gratitude, and I am committed in using my opportunities in raising awareness of the achievements, the challenges, as well as the accomplishments that have been contributed to our society by Indigenous cultures. Today, it is my honor and privilege to speak to you on the development of Canada's first mosque, the Al-Rashid, as well as the pioneering Muslim community that helped make it happen. So the first question I am being asked is why was Edmonton the home of Canada's first mosque? I think before we can answer that question, it's important to understand how the Muslim community first began to develop itself in Edmonton and how they gained the support to be able to build Canada's first mosque. Were there interactions with Indigenous communities? As a matter of fact, when Muslims started arriving in Edmonton, Alberta, and prior to that, many of their interactions did occur with Indigenous communities, and it was as a result of the peddling and traveling sales that they were involved in. In fact, they didn't only just trade, they shared information and knowledge and skills as well. Several Arab traders had learned how to trap and clean furs and trade furs through Indigenous communities. And as a result, they had learned how to trap furs from Indigenous people and then trade with the Hudson Bay Company. But then also many of the Arab traders didn't necessarily just trade for other goods and items. They had an understanding with Indigenous peoples as well, in the sense that they understood that often they could cut deals or make bargains that the HBC companies simply couldn't or wouldn't. So by the nature of being more personable and direct and visiting them rather than having to ask for pass cards or anything like that, there was rather some cordial relationships between various Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples, and the early Arab Muslim traders who were visiting their communities. The early Muslim community arrived here in Edmonton in the late 1800s and started to grow in the earlier 1900s. But nonetheless, by the time the first mosque in Canada was built, the population of the Muslim community in Edmonton was roughly around between 200 to 400 individuals. And many of them arrived in Western Canada and in Alberta specifically as a result of fewer opportunities available for them in Eastern Canada. But through the families and the networks that they had ended up connecting with in Canada, they were often utilized as wholesalers and peddlers and selling goods and wares from community to community on their way to Western Canada and then in and around Western Canada as well, often competing with trading posts like the Hudson Bay Company. So it was through this process of mobile and traveling sales that they slowly began to open up local businesses and establish themselves as a community in Edmonton. Now, following the trade industry, after Muslims had established themselves a little bit more solidly in Edmonton, they started to pick on more professional careers. Many of them had joined the Canadian military and participated in the Great War, otherwise known as World War I in our day and age, and many became ambassadors to various parts of the international community as well. And then, of course, their experience in business led them into other areas. Today, many Muslims have become anchors of our community as either engineers or real estate developers and various other professions. But it was a rather humble beginning in the start, and we owe a lot of our ability to establish ourselves to the kindness of the neighbors, of the people that accepted us not only in their society and communities, but then also helped us understand the environment and the situations that we are entering into as a result as well. Who was HILWIE HAMDON? What was her role in the founding of the Al-Rashid Mosque? Now, HILWIE HAMDON is a fascinating figure. She was in fact the president of the first Women's Muslim Council of the Al-Rashid Mosque in Edmonton here, and this is actually even before the mosque was established. What happened was that HILWIE HAMDON, who was the wife of Ali HAMDON, trader and peddler in his own right, who was very, very successful. He actually went back to Lebanon, married HILWIE, brought her back to Canada, and spent many years traveling between various cities, trading and peddling and just trying to build what life they can. As a result, they spent several years in Fort Chipewyan, and once the family's children were beginning to grow older, they had moved to Edmonton. And after having arrived in Edmonton, HILWIE was soon very active, not only in the Muslim community, but in society in general, getting to know new neighbors and taking a very active role in the social life of Edmonton's society. As a result, she had become president of the Muslim Women's Council, and together she and the Muslim Women's Council first approached Mayor John Fry, asking if there was a possibility for the Muslim community to establish a mosque in Edmonton. Now, this was in 1938, when all of North America was deep in the Great Depression and roughly 9 months before Canada entered World War I. And Mayor John Fry had committed a small parcel of land for the construction of the mosque if the Muslim community would be able to raise enough funds to build the mosque on that land. So as a result, HILWIE HAMDON and the Muslim Women's Committee then organized the Muslim community itself in helping to arrange a series of fundraisers through bake sales or raffles or just collecting money door to door from neighbors of all kinds, from various backgrounds and different religious affiliations, or even the local business owners who, despite being in the Great Depression, were nonetheless willing to contribute and support the cause of the mosque. So Ms. HILWIE HAMDON was very influential in organizing and spearheading the fundraising efforts for the construction of Canada's first mosque. How was the mosque built and who was involved in its construction? Well, the mosque was actually built through the assistance of a contractor by the name of Mr. Mike Dreeworth, who was of Ukrainian ancestry. And the structure, when many people walk by the outside, people are under the impression that it may have been a church or it is a reconverted building. But the fact is that the Al-Rashid Mosque was built purposely from the ground up to be a mosque. And the building structure is representative of many of the building structures or church structures that would have been common in Edmonton at the time, with a few minor details, such as the two towers in the front are more iconic of Islamic mosques, and those towers otherwise would be known as minarets. The minarets, however, are capped with the Cyrillic or an onion dome, which are more common features of Eastern European architecture. And of course, the long hall format of many churches is something that would otherwise be found very commonly in and around Edmonton and most Canadian neighborhoods. So what does the mosque interior look like? Now, the mosque interior is actually really quite simple. It consists of the main prayer hall, which is really just an open space. Adjacent to the prayer hall is the area for wudu, which is a ceremonial ritualistic washing that Muslims perform before we enter into prayer. And then and the opposite end of the hall is the imam's office, where the imam would present and work on their notes just ahead of congregational prayers. Also, the imam's office would be used by visiting dignitaries to prepare for their own presentations, as well as used by brides during wedding ceremonies. They would be waiting in the room to be reunited with their grooms during their marriages. And the mosque itself, it was multi-purposed. The Muslims used it as, of course, a place of worship, but then the space was also shared by the community and the neighborhood for various events and programs as well. How was the money raised to purchase the land for the mosque, and how much would the mosque cost to build today? As I mentioned earlier, the fundraising for the mosque consisted of a variety of different formats of fundraising, such as bake sales, raffle ticket sales, asking friends and neighbors, soliciting corporate donations, and the Muslim community, led by the Muslim Women's Council, was really quite successful in accomplishing raising those funds. And the total cost of the construction totaled to roughly $8,000, about $6,000 for the land itself, and between $2,000 to $3,000 for the construction process. Now, in today's values, that would roughly equate to about $100,000 to $120,000, but that doesn't also factor into our concept of understanding what the cost of materials, availability of materials, or whatnot would be. Building a mosque of that size now would be closer to $750,000 to about $1 million of today's values. All right, final thoughts. One of the questions that I often receive is, why Edmonton? Why is it that Edmonton ended up being host to establishing Canada's first mosque? Now, I can often say it's because this is where the largest population of Muslims existed in Canada at the time, but that's only roughly between 200 to 400 Muslims, and not a very impactful population of and by itself, except for the fact that they ended up being so. Also, we can say that the circumstances were right at the time, except the circumstances weren't necessarily ideal either. We were in the middle of the Great Depression and roughly 9 months before entering World War II. So It becomes, to me, a more of a personal opinion as to why it is Edmonton was the location of Canada's first mosque. I personally believe that this land is a sacred place, and just as the Indigenous communities have always acknowledged that this land is not only sacred, but the reciprocity and appreciation and gratitude towards this land is what facilitates our life and livelihood over here, is what the Muslim community demonstrated in how they had established their lives over here, that we were responsible and productive members of the society, in which society then reciprocated their support towards us in establishing Canada's first mosque. But then also, there's much to reflect on the fact that acknowledging that this is a sacred land, we have a responsibility to then support the principles and the cultures and the ancestry of the Indigenous cultures that have always considered this land sacred.